Welcome to the D.E.A.D podcast, where I discuss all things spooky and weird. I'm Desi, and today I'll be talking about the origin of Halloween. Let's get started. Hey everyone, how is everyone tonight? What is everyone up to? When this goes live, it will be Halloween, so I hope everyone is doing something spooky and scary and enjoying the day. I still don't know what I'm doing, but I'm excited to have the day off and see what I get into. I'm also excited that it's going to be cold. I get to wear my spooky sweatshirts, so I'm happy about that. We are currently in the process of getting a cold front. Because of that, I am wearing one of my spooky sweatshirts, and it is kind of like a tie-dye sweatshirt, and it has Jigsaw guy from Saw. It has Jason Voorhees, and it has the clown from It. And it's cool, tie-dye, has pink in it, so it's spooky but cute, which is what I like. So I'm excited to be wearing that. And I am just having a beer tonight. I'm having a Coors. Nice chill evening. Recording for you the story of Halloween. Now, I am going to be talking about a couple of things. I wanted to talk about the origin of Halloween and how it got started and all that, but what kind of ties into it is also the Day of the Dead, because it's just a few days, it's from Halloween to a few days after. And so I love the history behind that too. So I want to tell a story about that. And then I have a little true crime sprinkled in for you too. So this will probably be a long episode or longer than my usual episode. So let's get going. Okay, so like I mentioned, I want to talk about the origin of Halloween and how it has evolved today. So Halloween is a holiday celebrated each year on October 31st. This day marked the end of summer and the harvest, and the beginning of the dark, cold winter, a time of year that was often associated with human death. The tradition originated with the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, when people would light bonfires, wear costumes to ward off ghosts. Celts believed that on the night before the new year, the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead became blurred. In addition to causing trouble and damaging crops, Celts thought that the presence of the otherworldly spirits made it easier for the Druids or the Celtic priests to make predictions about the future. For a people entirely dependent on the volatile natural world, these prophecies were an important source of comfort during the long, dark winter. To commemorate the event, Druids built huge, sacred bonfires where the people gathered to burn crops and animals as sacrifices to the Celtic deities. During the celebration, the Celts wore costumes, typically consisting of animal heads and skins, and attempted to tell each other's fortunes. When the celebration was over, they relit their hearth fires, which they had extinguished earlier that evening, from the sacred bonfire to help protect them during the coming winter. By AD 43, the Roman Empire had conquered the majority of Celtic territory. In the course of the 400 years that they ruled the Celtic lands, two festivals of Roman origin were combined with the traditional Celtic celebration of Samhain. The first was Feralia, a day in late October when the Romans traditionally commemorated the passing of the dead. The second was a day to honor Pomona, the Roman goddess of fruit and trees. The symbol of Pomona is the apple, and the incorporation of this celebration into Samhain probably explains the tradition of bobbing for apples that is practiced today on Halloween. On May 13th, AD 609, Pope Boniface IV dedicated the Pantheon in Rome in honor of all Christian martyrs, and the Catholic feast of All Martyrs' Day was established in the Western Church. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as a day to honor all saints, as well as martyrs. Soon, All Saints' Day incorporated some of the traditions of Samhain. The evening before was known as All Hallows Eve, and later Halloween. Over time, Halloween evolved into a day of activities like trick-or-treating, carving jack-o'-lanterns, festive gatherings, donning costumes, and eating treats. When Halloween came to America, the celebration was extremely limited in colonial New England because of the rigid Protestant belief systems there. Halloween was much more common in Maryland and the southern colonies, as the beliefs and customs of different European ethnic groups and the American Indians meshed. A distinctly American version of Halloween began to emerge. The first celebration included play parties, which were public events held to celebrate the harvest. Neighbors would share stories of the dead, tell each other's fortunes, dance, and sing. Colonial Halloween festivities also featured the telling of ghost stories and mischief-making of all kinds. By the middle of the 19th century, annual autumn festivities were common, but Halloween was not yet celebrated everywhere in the country. In the second half of the 19th century, America was flooded with new immigrants. These new immigrants, especially the millions of Irish fleeing the Irish potato famine, helped to popularize the celebration of Halloween nationally. Borrowing from European traditions, Americans began to dress up in costumes and go house to house asking for food and money, a practice that eventually became today's trick-or-treat tradition. Young women believed that on Halloween they could divine the name or appearance of their future husband by doing tricks with yarn, apple parings, or mirrors. In the late 1800s, there was a move in America to mold Halloween into a holiday more about community and neighborly get-togethers than about ghosts, pranks, and witchcraft. At the turn of the century, Halloween parties for both children and adults became the most common way to celebrate the day. Parties focused on games, foods of the season, and festive costumes. Parents were encouraged by newspapers and community leaders to take anything frightening or grotesque out of Halloween celebrations, which, boring. That's literally the best part of Halloween, in my opinion, is to be scared and all the scary stuff. What's the point then? But anyways, because of these efforts, Halloween lost most of its superstitious and religious overtones by the beginning of the 20th century. By the 1920s and 1930s, Halloween had become a secular but community-centered holiday, with parades and town-wide Halloween parties as the featured entertainment. Despite the best efforts of many schools and communities, vandalism began to plague some celebrations in many communities during this time. By the 1950s, town leaders had successfully limited vandalism, and Halloween had evolved into a holiday directed mainly at the young. Due to the high numbers of young children during the 50s baby boom, parties moved from town civic centers into the classroom or home, where they could be more easily accommodated. Between 1920 and 1950, the centuries-old practice of trick-or-treating was also revived. Trick-or-treating was a relatively inexpensive way for an entire community to share the Halloween celebration. In theory, families could also prevent tricks being played on them by providing the neighborhood children with small treats. Thus, a new American tradition was born, and it has continued to grow. Today, Americans spend an estimated $6 billion annually on Halloween, making it the country's second largest commercial holiday after Christmas. I would make it the first holiday, personally, but that's just me. Speaking of commercial success, scary Halloween movies have a long history of being box office hits. Classic Halloween movies include the Halloween franchise, obviously, based on the 1978 original film directed by John Carpenter and starring Donald Pleasence, Nick Castle, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Tony Moran. In Halloween, a young boy named Michael murders his 17-year-old sister and is committed to jail, only to escape as a teen on Halloween night and seek out his old home and a new target. A direct sequel to the original Halloween was released in 2018, starring Jamie Lee Curtis and Nick Castle. A sequel to that, Halloween Kills, was released in 2021, and a sequel to that, Halloween Ends was released in 2022. Considered a classic horror film down to its spooky soundtrack, Halloween inspired other iconic slasher films like Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street, which I talked about last week, and Friday the 13th. More family-friendly movies include Hocus Pocus, The Nightmare Before Christmas, Beetlejuice, and It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. The American Halloween tradition of trick-or-treating probably dates back to the early All Souls' Day parades in England. During the festivities, poor citizens would beg for food and families would give them pastries called soul cakes in return for their promise to pray for the family's dead relatives. The distribution of soul cakes were encouraged by the church as a way to replace the ancient practice of leaving food and wine for roaming spirits. The practice, which was referred to as going a souling, was eventually taken up by children who would visit the houses in their neighborhood and be given ale, food, and money. The tradition of dressing in costumes for Halloween has both European and Celtic roots. Hundreds of years ago, winter was an uncertain and frightening time. Food supplies often ran low, and for the many people afraid of the dark, the shortened days of winter were full of constant worry. On Halloween, when it was believed that ghosts came back to the earthly world, people thought that they would encounter ghosts if they left their homes. To avoid being recognized by these ghosts, people would wear masks when they left their homes after dark so that the ghosts would mistake them for fellow spirits. This seems kind of weird. They're ghosts or spirits. Can't they see everything? I mean, surely they would know that you were wearing a disguise. I don't know. To me, it just seems kind of dumb, but okay. On Halloween, to keep ghosts away from their houses, people would place bowls of food outside their homes to appease the ghosts and prevent them from attempting to enter. In the early 20th century, Halloween costumes were geared towards spooky themes as opposed to current events, and were mostly homemade. The goal of early costumes wasn't necessarily to dress up as a particular creature or character, but rather to conceal one's identity in a spooky way that evoked themes like ghosts, witches, black cats, or the moon. Since teenage pranksters were known to wreak havoc on Halloween night, starting around the Great Depression, adults started organizing neighborhood activities like trick-or-treating, haunted houses, and costume parties to keep young people from making trouble. Box costumes, which I will say, box costumes. When I say that, I think they're meaning like store-bought costumes, like from the store. Just so you know, I think that's what it means. Box costumes were considered expensive luxuries during the Great Depression era, so most families continued to make their own Halloween outfits using costume patterns. As parents encouraged community activities for children on Halloween, costumes expanded to include characters that children might have seen and enjoyed. In the 1950s, mass-produced box costumes became more affordable, so more kids began to use them to dress up. Costumes in the 1950s also started to take inspiration from current events, such as the launch of Sputnik in 1957. As store-bought costumes became more affordable, parents could suit up their children for the holiday at the last minute. Halloween masks became more elaborate in the 1960s. Movies became popular costume inspirations. The 1970s saw some more changes to Halloween costumes. This is the period when Americans began wearing presidential masks, particularly the most famous of all, Richard Nixon in 1978. Sexy versions of costumes for women were common from the 1960s on and became an established commercial product in the 1990s. Box costumes could transform young children into superheroes for the night. Halloween costumes in the 1970s and 80s became more gruesome with the rise of slasher horror movies. Horror movies also cemented Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees masks as classic horror costumes. In 1995, the year of the O.J. Simpson trial, costume shops sold hundreds of masks of both Simpson and the presiding judge. Halloween has always been a holiday filled with mystery, magic, and superstition. It began as a Celtic end of summer festival during which people felt especially close to deceased relatives and friends. For these friendly spirits, they set places at the dinner table, left treats on doorsteps, and along the side of the road lit candles to help loved ones find their way back to the spirit world. Today's Halloween, ghosts are often depicted as more fearsome and malevolent, and our customs and superstitions are scarier too. We avoid crossing paths with black cats, afraid that they might bring us bad luck. This idea has its roots in the Middle Ages when people believed that witches avoided detection by turning themselves into black cats. We try not to walk under ladders for the same reason. This superstition may have come from the ancient Egyptians who believed that triangles were sacred, and around Halloween especially, we try to avoid breaking mirrors, stepping on cracks in the road, or spilling salt. So, going hand in hand with Halloween, or celebrated directly after Halloween, is the Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos. Now, this is my favorite also. I am in love with sugar skulls and pretty much have sugar skull everything. So, naturally, I wanted to tell y'all the history behind it and how it is celebrated today also. The Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos, is a Mexican holiday where families welcome back the souls of their deceased relatives for a brief reunion that includes food, drink, and celebration. The holiday is celebrated each year from October 31st to November 2nd. While October 31st is Halloween, November 2nd is All Souls' Day, or the Day of the Dead. According to the tradition, the gates of heaven are open at midnight on November 31st slash November 1st, and the spirits of children can rejoin their families for 24 hours. The spirits of adults can do the same on November 2nd. I'll go more into that later on. The roots of the Day of the Dead are celebrated in contemporary Mexico and among those of Mexican heritage in the United States and around the world. This goes back some 3,000 years to the rituals honoring the dead of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Upon dying, a person was believed to travel to the land of the dead. Only after getting through 9 challenging levels, a journey of several years, could the person's soul finally reach the resting place. In Nahua rituals honoring the dead traditionally held in August, family members provided food, water, and tools to aid the deceased in this difficult journey. This inspired the contemporary Day of the Dead practice, in which people leave food and other offerings on their loved ones' graves or set them out on a makeshift altar called ofrendas in their homes. Although related to the simultaneous Christian remembrances for Hallowtide, it has a much less solemn tone and is portrayed as a holiday of joyful celebration rather than mourning. The multi-holiday involves family and friends gathering to pay respects and to remember friends and family members who have died. These celebrations can take a humorous tone as family members remember funny events and memories about the departed. El Dia de los Muertos is not as commonly thought a Mexican version of Halloween, though the 2 days do share some traditions, including costumes and parades. On the Day of the Dead, it's believed that the border between the spirit world and the real world dissolve. During this brief period, the souls of the dead awaken and return to the living world to feast, drink, dance, and play music with their loved ones. In turn, the living family member treat the deceased as honored guests in their celebrations and leave the deceased's favorite foods and other offerings at grave sites or on the ofrendas built in their homes. Ofrendas can be decorated using calaveras, candles, bright marigolds, alongside food like stacks of tortillas and fruit. During Dia de Muertos, the tradition is to build private altars or ofrendas containing the favorite foods and beverages, as well as photos and memorabilia of the departed. The intent is to encourage visits by the souls, so the souls will hear the prayers and the words of the living directed to them. These altars are often placed at home or in public spaces such as schools or libraries, but it is also common for people to go to the cemeteries to place these altars next to the tombs of the departed. Marigold is the traditional flower used to honor the dead. In modern Mexico, the marigold is sometimes called Flor de Muerto or flower of dead. These flowers are thought to attract souls of the dead to the offerings. It is also believed the bright petals with a strong scent can guide the souls from the cemeteries to their families' homes. Toys are also brought for dead children, los angelitos, or the little angels, and bottles of tequila for adults. Tamales are one of the most common dishes prepared for this day. Families will also offer trinkets or the deceased's favorite candies on the grave. Some families put foods such as candied pumpkin and pan de muerto, or bread of the dead, which is a type of a sweet roll shaped like a bun, topped with sugar and often decorated with bone-shaped pieces of the same pastry. In addition to food, beverages are also important to the tradition. Historically, the main alcoholic drink was pulque, while today families will commonly drink the favorite beverage of their deceased ancestors. Other drinks associated with the holiday are atole and champurrado, which is a warm, thick, non-alcoholic masa drink, which doesn't sound very good to me, but that's just me. Some ofrendas feature a Christian cross, statues or pictures of the Blessed Virgin Mary, pictures of the deceased relatives, and candles. Pillows and blankets are also left out so the deceased can rest after their long journey. In some parts of Mexico, people spend all night beside the graves of their relatives. In many places, people have picnics at the grave site as well. Traditionally, families spend some time around the altar praying and telling stories about the deceased. A common symbol of the holiday is the sugar skull or calavera, which display colorful designs and are placed on the ofrendas to represent the vitality and individual personality of the departed. The skulls are often drawn with a smile as to laugh at death itself. They take many forms, such as sugar candies, clay decorations, and most memorable, face paintings. Since Dia de los Muertos is celebrated over several days, this is how the celebration starts. On November 1st at 12 a.m., Dia de los Angelitos, or Day of the Little Angels, starts the holiday, where the spirits of all deceased children are believed to be reunited with their families for 24 hours. On November 2nd at 12 a.m., Dia de los Difuntos, Day of the Adults, the celebrations shift to honor the lives of the departed adults. The night is filled with laughter and fun memories, much like the night before. And finally, on November 2nd at noon is Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, is the grand finale and public celebration. In more recent times, people come together in their cities, dressed up with calavera painted faces, and have parades in the streets. Believe it or not, Mexicans are not the only ones to celebrate Day of the Dead. It is a widely celebrated holiday all over the world. In fact, many religious communities celebrate All Souls Day, also known as All Saints Day, during the same time as Day of the Dead. The act of honoring the dead is widely celebrated around the world, but Day of the Dead is unique in its traditions. The ofrenda, the meaning of life and death, the use of calaveras, the style influenced by La Cantrina, and more recently, the festivals in the streets. So next, I'm going to be talking about a little true crime story, and this is the Candy Man, or the man who killed Halloween. So, of course, we have all gone trick-or-treating growing up, And I'm sure we remember hearing old warnings about kids getting razor blades in their apples or poisoned candy. But we probably all thought our parents made these stories up to scare us kids from eating too much candy. But it really did happen, and it's the reason Halloween changed forever. On a rainy Halloween night in 1974, the children of Deer Park, Texas, yes, this happened in Texas, where I am, shocker, were out knocking on doors. Ronald Clark O'Brien was out too, watching over his kids, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, as they trick-or-treated in a suburban neighborhood near their home. Joining them was the O'Brien's neighbor, Jim Bates, and his young son. One house the group visited was dark and no one answered the door. As the kids moved on and Jim followed, O'Brien stayed behind, allegedly to see if anyone was home. Catching up with the others a short while later, Ronald had good news. He claimed that a man, whose face he did not see, had opened the door and given him pixie stick candy for the children. He gave the tubes filled with flavored sugar to 5 children, including his own. Before bed, Timothy was allowed one treat from the evening's haul. He picked up his pixie stick tube. He struggled to open it as it was stapled shut. His dad, Ronald, helped him open the package. Timothy tasted the powder, and he complained that it tasted bitter. So Ronald grabbed him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash the taste away. Tragically, by the end of the night, O'Brien's 8-year-old son Timothy would be more than hurt. At bedtime, the boy collapsed from unbearable stomach pain, and on the way to the hospital, he died. Authorities determined that he had ingested cyanide-laced candy. Days later, they arrested O'Brien for the murder of his son. Ronald Clark O'Brien lived with his wife Deneen and 2 children, Timothy and Elizabeth, in Deer Park, Texas, a middle-class suburb of Houston. He worked as an optician and served as a deacon at a Baptist church, where he sang in the choir and oversaw the parochial bus program. Those who knew O'Brien considered him a model citizen. One pastor described O'Brien as a good Christian man and above average father. In reality, O'Brien had difficulty holding down a job. He was employed by 21 different companies over a 10-year period and fired from each for negligence or fraudulent behavior. In the fall of 1974, 30-year-old O'Brien was on the brink of being fired again after his employer, Texas State Optical, suspected him of stealing money. His take-home salary of $150 a week barely covered food and rent, and it was later discovered that he was more than $100,000 in debt. He had defaulted on several bank loans, and his car was on the verge of being repossessed. He ended up purchasing 4 insurance policies for his 2 children. His wife would testify at his trial that she was unaware of the 2 larger policies or of O'Brien's apparent murderous plans. When Timothy's body was brought to the morgue, the medical examiner recalled the scent of almonds coming from the boy's mouth, often a telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. An autopsy later confirmed that Timothy had consumed enough potassium cyanide to kill 2 or 3 grown-ass men. That is crazy. Police were able to recover the remaining sweets from the other children before any of them had a chance to dig in, and noted that whoever was responsible had used staples to seal the pixie sticks after tampering with them. That is what saved one of the boys' life that night. They found him in bed with the sweet in his hand, but he wasn't strong enough to undo the staples. Tests later found that the top 2 inches of the pixie stick had been packed with the poison. Investigators had O'Brien and Bates retrace their steps from Halloween night. O'Brien gave conflicting accounts as to which house handed out the poisoned candy, and he never saw the person's face. When he finally remembered which house, the owner was not home at the time, so the officers went to his place of work, which was Houston's William Hobby Airport, and arrested him in front of his colleagues. The mystery was over. Case closed. Only the man had an alibi. It turned out he was working that night. His wife and daughter were home and had turned out the lights early because they ran out of candy. Colleagues and timesheets confirmed the man's story. Investigators started to become suspicious. As police dug deeper, they learned that O'Brien had inquired with several chemical companies on where to buy cyanide and jokingly asked how much it would take to kill a person. They found a pocket knife in O'Brien's home with candy residue on it, suggesting how the candy might have been contaminated. They soon learned about O'Brien's financial problems and discovered he had taken out multiple life insurance policies on his children. They also found a piece of adding machine tape. On it, O'Brien had written the amount of each of his bills. The total came out to almost the exact amount he stood to collect from the insurance proceeds. Although O'Brien played the part of a grieving father and maintained his innocence, after failing a polygraph, he was arrested on November 5, 1974, and charged with Timothy's murder. As the investigation continued, the evidence started to stack up around Ronald. It turned out O'Brien was going to community college, and in class he would ask his professor which type of poison was more lethal. Another witness, who worked for a chemical company in Houston, told police a man had come in to buy some cyanide, but left after being told the smallest amount he could buy was 5 pounds. The man from the store couldn't identify O'Brien, but he remembered he was wearing a beige or blue smock like a doctor. O'Brien was an optician, so that was his exact uniform. Ronald entered a not guilty plea, with his defense blaming the tainted candy on some untraceable boogeyman, a sick individual using the cover of Halloween to poison unsuspecting children. But friends, family, and co-workers all testified against the man the press was now calling the Candy Man. According to Joni Johnston, a forensic psychologist and private investigator, poisoners as a group typically lack empathy, evidenced by the premeditated nature in which they kill and the cold, calculating strategy they often use. Poisoning is also an instrument for someone who is kind of cunning and sneaky, not somebody who is going to be physically or verbally abusive. They are also more likely to be polite behind the scenes, and as a result, they tend to fool people. But O'Brien's days of fooling people were over. On June 3, 1975, after less than an hour of deliberations, a Harris County jury returned with a guilty verdict for one charge of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. An hour later, it was decided that Ronald would be executed by electric chair. After being found guilty, O'Brien appealed his case multiple times, twice to the Supreme Court. In the end, all appeals were denied. By this point, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled the electric chair as cruel and unusual punishment, so O'Brien was executed by lethal injection on March 31st, 1984, at the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville. O'Brien's last words were, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death." Outside the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, a crowd of around 300 people gathered to hear if the man, the Halloween poisoner, had met his end, shouting, "Trick or treat," and throwing candy at anti-death penalty protesters. O'Brien is now known by the nicknames "The Man Who Killed Halloween" and "The Candy Man." Before and since the Deer Park poisoning, rumors of dodgy sweets being handed out have always surfaced around Halloween. But whether the fear is that the candies contain broken glass or razor blades, or that they're actually ecstasy pills, there's not much evidence to suggest parents actually have anything to be worried about. Since Timothy O'Brien, there has not been a single case where a child has actually died after consuming contaminated Halloween treats. Despite this, parents continue, even over 40 years later, to check their children's candy to make sure it hasn't been tampered with. So that is all I have for you. So I will say Halloween is my favorite holiday, obviously. I've always loved Halloween, and it's always been really big for me. I remember growing up going to my aunt's house. She lives like the next town over, and I always like to dress up like princesses. One of my favorite one year, I bugged my mom for me to be Jasmine from Aladdin. And you want to know why? Because I was dying to show off my midriff. I forgot how old I was, but I was young. And I don't know, apparently I wanted to be a little hoochie, I don't know. But I was like, I remember that because I was just like dying to be her. Um, so yeah, it was real cute. And I wore these like little like white slip on sandal things. And then I had like a windbreaker jacket on because it was like kind of cold. It was the funniest outfit. If I can find the picture, I will post on Instagram. I also do celebrate the Dia de los Muertos, but that has been more recent. We decorate one of our like side tables as our ofrenda, and we put photos of our family members and friends that have passed on, and we'll put calaveras around it, and we'll put flowers. We don't put food or drinks or anything like that because we have cats and they'll get into it. But we do that. I remember for Halloween in 2020, I got to celebrate with my niece and my nephew, it was his first Halloween. My sister-in-law did my makeup like a sugar skull. She did all of our faces, and it was so fun going around trick-or-treating and dressed up like that. I loved it. It was a blast. So yeah, I really enjoy it. But I want to know, do any of y'all celebrate Dia de los Muertos? What do y'all do for Halloween? What are y'all doing tonight? And those of you who have kids, do y'all check their candies before, or do y'all tell them that so you can eat the candy? Or maybe both? That brings me to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening to the D.E.A.D podcast. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at the D.E.A.D podcast. Also, feel free to send in your stories, episode suggestions, or feedback at the deadpodcast1 at gmail.com, or send me a DM on Instagram. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you are listening on, and be sure to come back next week for my next episode. Happy Halloween!